So Joe Nattori, I'm responsible for global healthcare investing at Goldman Sachs. Long time fan of pharma outsourcing. I have $3.5 billion of capital in this sector, so I'm really excited about this panel. Wanted to quickly introduce the panel. I'm not going to go into detail. Definitely, this is a really excellent panel that has been put together. But we're going to try to keep it very practical. And so, how does real-world data get utilized in clinical trials? And we're going to really get into what's been going on, what's the promise, what are the issues, and finally, we're going to get to the real practical question, which is, who's going to do it? So let me quickly introduce, and all four of these panelists really represent different facets of the constituency. So we'll start with to my left, Jamie McDonald, who's the CEO of Parexel. Then we have Najat Khan, who is the Chief Data Science Officer and Global Head of Janssen's R&D Strategy and Operations at Johnson & Johnson. Andy von Eschenbach, who is the former commissioner at the FDA. And Jill Pellegrino, who's the VP of Recruitment and RWD at CVS Trials and CVS Health. So let's start with the first topic, which is really around what's the near-term use of this data, and where do we think we'll end up with it? And maybe I'll just go left to right, and then we'll mix it up. Jamie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think there's lots of short-term promise. I think we're already seeing that. Najat and I were talking about some of the work that Janssen's doing, but I think in the clinical trial space, one example would be synthetic control arms. So the ability to build a study where the control arm is coming from real-world data versus having to build out a separate enrolled trial. That speeds up the trial, it reduces the exposure to patients, and minimizes cost as well. So there are examples of that coming through that I think are going to be very beneficial. It's complex, there's a process, but I think if we refine that, it can certainly be a real advantage. The same, in theory, could be done on the placebo side as well. So you're starting to streamline study design, requiring less patients and therefore less time and cost.
Yeah, no, I think you've touched on a couple of good ones. I was just reflecting a little bit that I get asked this question pretty often, and I think the answer changes every 6 months. As you see those, incremental, I hope I could say more than incremental changes that are happening, because it takes the entire ecosystem for us to change together. So in terms of areas where I think you're having impact, we're having impact, and also across the industry here and now, is if you think about how you do protocol study design, right? Incorporate KOL input, but then also what's the patient journey in the real world? And really important, equally I would say in disease areas that we know well, because we all have our biases, right? It's really good to look at the data and say, what are patients taking? What's the right inclusion-exclusion criteria? You can be smarter in your design. But the other is also newer disease areas, rare diseases as an example, where there's high unmet need, or even in oncology where the standard of care is changing quite quickly, right? So I think that's one area because it helps you anticipate what your right comparator is going to be. Tied to that is the other point that you mentioned, which is around external control arm. What I would say is let's be even more aggressive in terms of using real-world data to simulate control arms, external control arms for phase 2, to A, understand what your effect size could be, B, also then envision what your registrational, if you do it, ECA could look like. So this whole concept of go, no-go decision-making that we do internally, there's a lot that we can do. And as a sponsor for us, we shouldn't self-constrain ourselves and not leveraging that. And then the third piece I would also say is really around how you do trials. I think that's fundamentally shifted. And I remember for us, a couple of years ago, it started with COVID, using machine learning algorithms to really predict where the hotspots are going to be. I remember talking about it a year ago and actually factor in more data so that we over-index for areas that have more diversity. We ended up having one of the most diverse clinical trials with African American as an example, participation being higher than census number. Not just a little bit, but significantly higher. Now we've done that across multiple more studies. That's what I want to see, that we take the learnings from COVID and we actually scale it. So we've seen that in our IBD trials, we've seen that in our rare disease trials. It takes a ton of work. It's not just real world data, it's the clinical team and the operational follow through and our partners that we work with. So that's what I would say. I think you're seeing the whole shift happening. And then the last thing I'll say is the policies are also changing quite a bit, right? We are learning more as we go. We're doing more pre-specification conversations with the FDA and other regulators. That's really helping us to understand and anticipate what some of the gaps might be versus not.
Yeah, just to kind of add or amplify, and I come at it a little bit from the regulator's perspective, I think one short-term great opportunities to continue to utilize real-world evidence for label expansion. The science is helping us understand that at the mechanistic level, the commonality be what are very phenotypically different diseases. And if we can begin to capture the nuance of those individuals with those diseases that enable the regulator to be able to make that leap and cover that gap, we can get current medications, things are already on the shelf, out to much larger populations. So for me, utilizing real-world evidence so that the agency can be much more confident and comfortable with rapid approval of label expansion.
Really interesting. You start, and I guess you could see the thematic from the CRO all the way to the regulatory side. And Jill, we're going to get to the patient side as well, because we'd love your thoughts. But it's almost like a question of, is the data going to be used for efficiency, which is more on this side, or like new applications on the other side? And Jill, you sit squarely on the patient recruitment side, and that's like the practical, I think the stop point. Like, what do you think about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of near-term possibilities for using patient data and real-world data for both purposes, for both efficiencies in the way you're designing the trials and enrolling the trials, as well as finding new outcomes and additional data that can supplement the clinical trials for approval. In terms of the efficiencies, one of the real near-term possibilities that we see is using patient data in order to identify patients that would be appropriate for trials to recruit them in. You know, we see in clinical trials, trial enrollment is a common challenge that extends clinical trial timelines and increased costs to the overall system. And we know that only 5% of the population gets access to a clinical trial. So one of the things that we've really been exploring at CVS is how do we use the patient data that we have at CVS to really allow that other 95% to get access to trials. So we've been developing data models to really target that population and be able to bring trials that are appropriate to them, and we've seen some initial success in that, and we've been able to enroll 18,000 patients. So we're seeing that works, and we hear from the patient community that, you know, this is something that they really want to understand, and they really need help navigating clinical trials that they could be matched to.
Great. So the next question is, what are the roadblocks? What are the issues? How are we going to get there?
How would I get there?
And why don't we start, Andy, with you, since everybody thinks regulation is an issue. Might as well start there.
You know, I think COVID was very illuminating for me because through the Reagan-Udall worked very closely with FDA to really try to incorporate with Amy Abernathy there the utilization of real-world evidence to understand COVID and its impact on the population. And where I saw some of the barriers were being able to really come to grips with data interoperability and utilizing the same data standards and data elements. People were still very much in silos, but that really started to galvanize this sense of how do we create this same gauge track so that whatever the data is, it could move across the dimensions. The other side of the coin was, I think the other challenge was getting the agency to become much more confident and comfortable with real-world evidence. And that's a work in progress. I believe that the attitude is there to do that, but the means to do that remains to be worked out.
Does that mean we're in the first inning of that, or?
We're in the first stages.
First stages, okay, great. Jill?
Yeah, I think one of the limitations that I've seen is the comfort from the sponsors to allow flexibility in the way that you're structuring the trial, and namely in PI oversight. So if we think about the power of using the patient data to be able to identify that population that isn't always able to participate in trials, you can further that, you can make that even more successful if you're bringing the site to those patients. And there's a lot of limitations that prevent you from really maximizing that model around having the right PI oversight for that. So we're starting to see some success in that, where we're putting trials into our CVS Health hubs, and we're able to put the trials in the clinics where the patients are, but to really open that up across an extensive number of indications, there has to be loosened requirements around the protocol design and the oversight.
Najat, how about you?
Yeah, I would say, I see 3 roadblocks. The first one is, what are we trying to answer? What are the questions we're trying to answer? Because a lot of the times people go first with the algorithm or the data and not what's the question. So is it really that you need to improve recruitment? Is it really sometimes you're doing things that you couldn't do before? You want to diagnose patients earlier. You use data that's already collected today in order to see things you can't see before, so you can diagnose patients a few years earlier. Huge impact for patient outcomes. We have done that in the pulmonary hypertension space and just got breakthrough device designation for that. That's an idea, just purely using ECGs, which are always collected, to be able to pick up a rare disease early on. So that's one question. I think the second roadblock is we talk about real-world data sometimes in an isolation versus as a interdisciplinary set of tools or approaches, I would say. I don't want to use tools, that you can use to answer these questions. What do I mean by that? To me, real-world data is data. RCT, great. But you need to integrate approaches with AI, machine learning, digital health, and all of that to answer the questions. And I say that because, a lot of the times when you're doing trial design, for instance, going back to a question that point that Jill, you made around, openness of sponsors, we were looking at a study design, and it was in invasive E. coli, which leads to bacteremia, sepsis. It's really challenging disease, especially for those that are 65 and over. The normal way you do it is you just all comers, right? But what we did is we used real-world data and AI machine learning on top of that real-world data in order to determine what are the predictive risk factors, who is most at risk. And you find certain things that you wouldn't know before, age, certain health conditions. But we also found novel risk factors. Integrating those risk factors, ensuring you can pick it up in an EHR when you're actually trying to recruit the patient, making it practical. That was some of the hardest part of what we did, in addition to the analysis. And it's not just for us internally, but also with the CROs. But then what you see is you enrich the patient population. You can reduce the sample sizes, focus on the right patients, and this is the heart of precision medicine, right? You go to the right patients at the right time. And the very last thing I'll say covering all of that is culture. It's changing our behaviors, it's taking calculated risks. So much easier to actually go to the path of least resistance. But I think for all of us, we have to look at how do we incentivize? I mean, the answer is clear, right? Patients, sense of urgency to help patients. But in our day-to-day, how do we encourage that calculated risk-taking, not just for the sake of it, and then tie that to impact? I think those are the 3 things.
Here's a little bit of a provocative question that I've been thinking through, and maybe you could help me think through it more. As we become more reliant on data for patient eligibility, which is kind of where we're going directionally, does that mean when we think about how clinical research has really gone global, because we're searching for patients naive to therapy, whatever, however we're thinking about it, are we going to go the other way, where we're going to have to go to centers that do have strong data collection mechanisms, where we do have that where that is going to be the only place we do trials because we have the ability to
I think that would be the absolute wrong thing to do. And Jamie and I were just talking about that.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I mean, first of all, some of the data sets that we're looking at, just because you have the data, the real world data, and DataVant is doing a lot of this, to determine where the patients are in a de-identified way, it doesn't mean that those sites and locations are research experts. Right? And that's your question, are we narrowing? So then as an industry and as sponsors, we actually have to go in and ensure that we are investing to actually uplift, right, those centers. And why is that important? One of the rare diseases we looked at where the patients are. And I'll tell you, most people said, academic medical centers? Is it in the large centers? That's where we should go. Well, when we looked at the data, the answer was very different. You had 60 to 70% of the patients that were not in the academic medical centers. They were actually in community clinics. So then the next question is, how do you actually ensure that you have access for those trials to patients in those community clinics? One is referral, but we know that's mixed, right? But can we actually ground up, like help those centers to become more active in terms of research? And then the other thing, I think, Jill, you mentioned this before, is also, do we really need all the bells and whistles? It depends on your study and your trial.
Yeah.
Look at what Martin Landry did in Europe, right? And in the UK with the recovery trial. You're doing a vaccine trial. Can we think about it differently? And then the barrier to entry changes. So that's, and then the last thing, because diversity is very close to my heart, we had more diverse patients in those community clinics because they can't make it to the academic medical center. So that's what I mean, that culturally, we just have to think differently. You have to take those calculated risks. You have to make the call and say, no, we should be investing. Why, when there isn't a clear answer? So I completely agree with you, but we have to think differently.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be a little controversial here because I'm sitting between J&J and Janssen and CVS. And one of the answers to your question is Janssen J&J has a very rich database, but it's been distilled a priori because of who they wanted in that database. And it has great value, but CVS, on the other hand, has an immense population of patients. And so that could be a much richer database for purposes of real-world evidence if we had the acquisition, aggregation, and analytics that got it to the level of quality and purity that you'll find in this database. So you were telling me how many patients you have?
100 million lives.
100
Yeah.
million lives?
Yeah.
Impressive.
But I would
Scary,
just,
but impressive.
but I would just say, in order for any industry and the kind of work that we're doing, if we relied just on our internal data, that would not work.
Right.
So we actually partner. I mean, at Janssen, we've done about 50 partnerships in the last 2
Partner
years.
with CVS?
CVS, we're partnering. We partner with other companies. I mean, the US, this is the good thing. You can actually have large, 100 to almost 300. But it's the data granularity and how real time is it that also matters. But then to another question you didn't ask me, I think about what happens in Asia, in
That's
certain
where I was
countries,
gonna get to Jamie.
right? Like in
Okay.
India, in China.
Yeah.
And there is a wave of that happening. And in Europe, it's very different because of privacy law. So you have to balance all components, but you're 100% right. We don't just rely on what we have internally.
Yeah. I mean, Jamie, this is where I wanted to get to, which is, we've gone international to find these patients, especially in oncology trials. They don't have the same data rigor that we hopefully will have here in terms of being a leader there. Like how does that work?
I think some of the data sets, it's very local.
Yeah.
And obviously privacy laws make it more challenging in other regions. But again, it's understanding standard of care, treatment paradigm, where do patients go, and have data sources that then allow you to understand prevalence and incidence of disease and the patient pathway and how they intersect with the healthcare system and physicians may use as investigators. I think that the other challenge that Najat sort of pointed to is we have, in theory, perfect data from a hypothesis in a randomized controlled trial, and everybody's conditioned that that is the gold standard. Real-world data is messy, and there's a lot of noise in the system, and it's imperfect. And in a lot of disease areas, we do not capture the endpoint that the regulators want as part of their approval process. So you're not necessarily conducting the diagnostic tests. You're not doing the ratings, screenings that are required as part of the approval process. You don't have the clinical outcomes assessment. You don't have the patient quality of life measures in real-world data. And therefore, there's still a bias to go back to a randomized controlled trial where we can collect data in a very tight environment. But ultimately, we want to know that that drug is safe and efficacious in an equivalent manner as it gets deployed into the real world, where there are comorbidities, the potential of drug-drug interactions, other variables that are actually deliberately excluded from the clinical trial process.
Yeah.
And we've seen a number of examples where drugs have been approved, received market authorization, and then have not shown the benefit in that patient population. I think the opportunity to design trials, maybe with conditional approval, and then a requirement for a robust real-world data gathering process. This was the original purpose of REMS, the idea that you had a risk mitigation strategy as your drug was approved. And we've sort of moved away from that, but the opportunity in real-world data, and again with tokenization as an example, your data is not just your EMR record at one institution, it's labs, it's pharmacy, it's other data that needs to be combined together to get a more holistic, longitudinal view of that patient and their lifetime. I think in some of the new therapies, particularly cell and gene, you're going to want to watch these patients for decades to understand is there a change in that patient's health as a consequence of their disease progressing in a way that we hadn't anticipated or watched in the clinical trial, or a long-term adverse effect of the drug or therapy that they were on.
So cleansing data, obviously, is a big issue. One of the other ones we talked about in the back was around consent. And so maybe Jill, since you sit on 100 million patients, how are you thinking about that issue?
Yeah, I think I actually would agree a lot with what Jamie said in terms of using real-world data to help supplement the information that's collected in clinical trials. With the CVS Health data, we have that starting point with the patients where we have some of their health plan data, we have their pharmacy, but I think that the power of that data is that we're able to engage with them directly and get a consent. So where we've seen in our real-world evidence studies is that if we're engaging that patient and inviting them to be an active participant in the trial, that allows to get that consent, to collect the data from different sources to make a more cohesive data set. But then it also allows you to collect those additional variables that would never be in the records, like the quality of life outcomes, how is disease impacting their daily lives, what are the perceptions. These are all really important data and information that influences how that drug is being used after it's approved.
So we kind of all danced around it, but one-word answers, and we'll just go through. Biggest issue in your mind in terms of really seeing the full potential realized in usage of data. Jamie, do you want to start?
Fear.
Fear?
So the fear that the data will lead to an outcome that somebody doesn't want.
Yeah.
If it's on the sponsor side, do they find out something that jeopardizes that portfolio for good or bad reasons, for the right or wrong reasons? For the regulators, I think the fear now is always approving a drug that later is demonstrated not to have the risk-benefit profile that they'd expected. So there is fear in the system of using a great asset to public health benefit, but somebody feels if I make a mistake and I make the wrong decision, I'm accountable. And so therefore it's easier to say no than yes.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I would say complacency. There is a feeling that, what we have today is good enough is absolutely not enough, right? So in terms of tokenizing, data, your clinical trial and your real-world data, and actually seeing the outcomes of patients and how that happens. Sometimes the response you'll get, well, we can just do a registry at some point. But what about those patients who committed their time to actually be part of your trial? What about seeing how they're doing afterwards? And then the first answer, people are not going to be recruited. You're going to have recruitment challenges. The consent rate's going to be low. We're getting over 50, 60, 70% consent rates. So it's also misunderstanding what the patients want and making decisions for them. I'd rather that we actually give options and take, like I was saying, the calculated risks, so we don't live in a place of complacency where things are good enough. They actually aren't, and we need to do better.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget there's a difference between real-world data and real-world evidence. And I think the big barrier at this point is we're making progress in acquisition and aggregation, but we're not there yet with analytics. The clinical trial structure, we get comfortable with a p-value. And I think we have to move in real-world evidence to that scientific rigor of analytics that give us both the confidence and the comfort that we know. And then when we know, we can act. And I think that's true both in the regulatory framework as well as in the healthcare delivery end of it. So that.
Can I just add one thing to what Andrew said, which is a really important part around rigor? And Jamie, you were saying, like, today, if you have a disease in the neuroscience space or immunology space, the endpoints are not structured. They're a composite, you score it. Well, it's kind of on us in order to use different devices. Like, we have an app that we're actually using in order to be able to monitor depression. But in order to do that, we had to first do observational phase 0 studies. See how it does versus current standard of care. Right? Then you can actually get acceptance to use it in a trial. But that's so important because that will never actually be captured in the real world. So I think as much as we say the data needs to be better, we also need to be better in terms of prospectively developing new data endpoints so it becomes more usable. So it's such a good point around the rigor, the work we need to do that. Jill?
I'm trying to sum up my answer in one word, but I don't think I can do that. I agree with what all the panelists have said. I think one of the biggest limitations, and this has been a theme throughout the day, is the inability to take all of this valuable data that the industry is trying to use and bringing it together in a cohesive, high-quality way. So that's where I'm really hoping and pushing for putting the patient at the center, because they're really the only party in all of this that can really control where that data is flowing and give the permissions to bring it together to really take advantage of some of these ideas we're talking about.
Leave it to the person from Goldman Sachs to say my answer would have been cost, but it's all right. Great. So the last topic, and we only have a few minutes, is really who is going to do this? Who is going to be responsible for making this happen? So maybe, Andy, we start with you.
Well, the answer is everybody. It takes a village, right? But I think there are different roles, and as I viewed it, I think government has a very important role in setting standards and facilitating. And I think the private sector has the critical role of actually implementing and doing. And so whether it's companies like Janssen and Janssen, or whether it's infrastructures like what CVS brings to the table, we need all of those parts and pieces. Government can help organize, coordinate, and orchestrate, but the doing is going to be coming from the private sector.
Jill?
I agree. I think that's a really important starting point, and it's going to remove a lot of the barriers for the other organizations and parties. I would add to that I think sponsors could really help drive a lot of that. Like, I like hearing, Najat, all the stuff that you're driving at Janssen, and what I've seen is a variation in the adoption from sponsors, and some are more forward-looking than others in using data across their entire organization.
How about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I agree with Andy. I think government has a role, but I think it should be minimal. I think setting the framework and the guidelines. I think data custodianship becomes an important topic in who has the data and how is it used or misused, and what are the consequences for that. But I think there's some collective organizations or collaborative groups. I think Transcelerate would be an example of a group that I think has enough members. You could look at pharma or bio or acro on the CRO side to really come together and build some of the detail behind the framework on how it can be used. Ultimately, we're trying to benefit patients and the healthcare system. 19% of GDP on healthcare, and ranking, I think, in the global index, probably 36th or something in healthcare outcomes. And morbidity age, obviously COVID-driven, is coming down. We have to do better as an industry and a country.
Najat?
Yeah, I would maybe use an example because it makes it real for me in terms of how we all come together. So we're talking about precision medicine and oncology. We're going after certain mutations. Only 10% of the patients are actually sequenced in the real world. And if you look at the number for those of color, it's even lower. So we have a medicine that can actually help patients for that mutation. It's not getting the access it needs. So we as a company need to answer the right question, which is how do we use currently collected data? Don't add burden to like a health system that's already overburdened. So what we did is we developed an algorithm, AI algorithm, using real world data, such as digital histopathology, which more hospitals are starting to digitize, we can actually predict the mutation from the phenotype, genotype from phenotype, with high accuracy. Well, that's great. What's the next step? That's not really helping the patient. It's a great paper. So then the question is, how do you deploy it in our clinical trial sites, which is working with our CRO partners? We're doing it across 100 sites. Why? Because that can actually screen patients better. So we can actually enrich our trials, we can run faster trials, we can get the medicine to the market faster for the patient. We work with our CROs for that. We work with regulators to say, how do we include that as a screening tool that's AI-based, it's a little bit different, pre-specification discussions. We work with many of the data partners in order to collect the data, because you don't want just internal data, as you reminded me. We want to make sure it's generalizable. We actually then have to work with the hospital systems, right, in order to actually not just deploy it, but use it real time and use it to screen patients. Their tech stack also has to go up to be able to enable that. And then, last but not the least, we have to get that data responsibility and share as to how it's working, and then use that for, greater access purposes. So I'm just trying to share an example here. Everybody plays a role. I agree that we need to start with a compelling enough question, that there is that conviction as to why we should all change how we do things to work towards that goal.
Excellent. Well, I think that's time.
Thank
So
you.
I want to thank the panelists. Wonderful discussion.
Thank you.